A suitcase hit the hallway floor with a bang. Then another. A woman was throwing clothes into them. Fast, not folding anything, just grabbing and stuffing and zipping. A man stood in the doorway with a dish towel still in his hand. He didn't move. He didn't shout. He just watched his whole life get packed into 2 bags in under 10 minutes. Say something, she snapped at him. He couldn't. His mouth opened and nothing came out. Down the hall, a small voice called out, asking why Mommy was crying. Neither of them answered her. The man's name was Daniel, and the woman zipping up those suitcases was his wife of 9 years, walking out the door for a man she'd met at the gym 6 weeks ago. What happened 3 weeks later, when someone knocked on his door, he never saw coming. Stay with me on this one. Let me back up. Because to understand why that knock on the door mattered so much, you have to understand the man who answered it. Daniel Reyes was 38 years old, and he was a good man. Not a perfect one. A good one. There's a difference, and it matters here. He got up at 5 every morning. He drove a forklift at a distribution warehouse out by the interstate, 10-hour shifts, for days a week, and he never once called in sick, because sick days didn't pay the mortgage. He coached his daughter's soccer team on Saturdays, even though he barely knew the rules. He was the kind of man who fixed his own car in the driveway, and helped the neighbors move furniture and never asked for anything back. He had married a woman named Vanessa when he was 29 and she was 26. And for 9 years, Daniel had given that marriage everything he had. He worked the overtime so she could stay home when their daughter was small. He never complained about the money. He told her she was beautiful every single morning, even the mornings she didn't answer. He was not an exciting man. He knew that. He was steady. He was reliable. He was there. Let me tell you one small thing about Daniel, so you understand exactly the kind of man we're talking about. His daughter, Lily, was 6 years old, and she was afraid of thunderstorms. Terrified. And every single time a storm rolled in, no matter the hour, no matter how early his shift started the next morning, Daniel would get out of bed, go into her room, and sit on the floor beside her bed until the thunder stopped. Sometimes that was 2 in the morning. Sometimes it was 4. He never once complained. He never once told her to toughen up. He just sat there in the dark, holding her small hand, telling her quiet stories until the storm passed, and she fell back asleep. Then he'd go to work on 3 hours of rest, and drive a forklift for 10 hours and never say a word about it to anyone. That was Daniel. That was the whole man, right there in that one thing. And somewhere along the way, Daniel started to notice that steady and reliable, and there were not the words his wife wanted to hear anymore. It started small. She joined a gym. Good for her, Daniel thought. She started going more. Then every day. Then twice a day. She got a personal trainer, a young guy named Brett, with a jaw like a comic book hero and a sports car he definitely couldn't afford on a trainer's salary. Daniel met him once, at a barbecue. Shook his hand. The guy had a grip like he was trying to prove something. Daniel wasn't stupid. He saw the way Vanessa's phone lit up at midnight. He saw the new clothes, the new perfume, the new laugh she used on the phone that he never heard in the kitchen. He saw the way she started criticizing him for things she used to love. The way he talked. The way he dressed. The fact that he was tired at the end of a 10-hour shift instead of bouncing off the walls with energy. He saw all of it. And here's the thing about a good man in a situation like that. He kept hoping he was wrong. He kept telling himself it was a phase, that she was just finding herself, that she'd come back around. He even started doing push-ups in the garage at night, quietly, where nobody could see, trying to become the kind of man he thought she wanted. Because the alternative was a thing he could not let himself look at directly. The alternative was that the woman he'd built his whole life around had simply decided he wasn't worth keeping. Then came the night with the suitcases. She didn't even give him the dignity of a real conversation. She just came home from the gym one Tuesday, walked past their daughter at the kitchen table, went into the bedroom, and started packing. When Daniel followed her in, she told him, flat, like she was reading a shopping list, that she wasn't happy. That she hadn't been happy in years. That Brett made her feel alive in a way Daniel never had. That she deserved passion, excitement. A man who took care of his body, who had ambition, who didn't smell like a warehouse at the end of the day. You're a good father, she told him, zipping the second bag. But being a good father isn't enough for me anymore. And then she was gone. Just like that. 9 years, out the door, into a sports car idling at the curb. Now here's what I need you to understand about the weeks that followed. It wasn't the loneliness that nearly broke Daniel. He could handle lonely. It was what she'd said. Being a good father isn't enough. Those words got inside him, and they set up shop. He'd lie awake at night and hear them. He'd look in the mirror in the morning, at the gray coming in at his temples, at the soft place around his middle that 10-hour shifts and no gym membership had given him, and he'd think, maybe she was right. Maybe I'm not enough. Maybe steady isn't worth anything. Maybe I'm just the boring guy who pays the bills while the exciting guys get the girl. He didn't tell anybody how bad it got. He got his daughter to school. He went to work. He came home and made dinner and read her a story and tucked her in. And then he sat alone in a quiet house and let those 4 words eat him alive. Being a good father isn't enough. There was one night, about a week after Vanessa left, that Daniel doesn't talk about much. Lily had asked him at dinner, in that direct way little kids have, whether mommy left because of something she had done, whether she'd been bad. And Daniel had to put down his fork and take his 6-year-old daughter by both shoulders and promise her, look her right in the eyes and promise her, that none of it was her fault, that she was perfect, that she was loved, that grown-ups sometimes make their own mistakes, and it has nothing to do with the children. And he held it together long enough to get her to bed. And then he went into the garage, and he sat down on an overturned bucket in the dark. And for the first time since he was a boy, Daniel Reyes put his face in his hands and cried. Not for himself, for his little girl, who was going to grow up in a house with one less person in it, and who was already, at 6 years old, learning to blame herself for it. He was 38 and he had decided, quietly, that he was finished, not in a dramatic way, just in the way a man decides he's done expecting anything good to happen to him ever again. He'd raise his girl, he'd work his shifts, and he would never, ever let himself be foolish enough to believe he was worth loving again. That was where Daniel Reyes was, 3 weeks after his wife left, on a cold Thursday evening, when somebody knocked on his front door. He almost didn't answer it. He figured it was Vanessa, come back for more of her things, or worse, come back with Brett to gloat. He set down his coffee. He walked to the door with his shoulders already up around his ears, braced for a fight he didn't have the strength for. He opened it, and it was not Vanessa. It was her mother. Margaret Cole stood on his porch in a heavy wool coat, her purse clutched in both hands, her breath fogging in the cold. She was 66 years old, a small, dignified woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, the kind of mother-in-law who had never quite approved of Daniel and had never quite hidden it either. In 9 years of marriage, Margaret had corrected his grammar, questioned his career, and made it clear, in 100 small ways, that her daughter had married beneath herself. And now here she was, on his porch, in the cold. Daniel's heart sank. Of course the family had sent Margaret, to tell him to sign the papers quietly, to not make a fuss, to let Vanessa go without a mess. He'd been expecting the family to close ranks against him, the way they always had, and here was the general herself, come to deliver the terms of his surrender. Margaret, he said. His voice was tired. If you're here about the divorce, I'm not going to fight it. She can have whatever she wants. Just tell her to leave me and my daughter alone. Margaret didn't say anything. She just looked at him, and Daniel noticed, for the first time, that her eyes were red, that her hands were shaking, and not just from the cold, that this proud, sharp woman looked like she hadn't slept in days. Can I come in? She asked. Her voice cracked on the second word. Please, Daniel. I need to talk to you, and I need you to just listen, because I have been quiet for far too long, and I cannot be quiet anymore. Now, if you've ever had somebody surprise you, right when you decided the whole world had lined up against you, if you've ever braced for another blow and gotten something else entirely, then you already know the strange feeling that went through Daniel in that doorway. And if you're still with me, take 1 second and hit that subscribe button, because what Margaret said when she sat down at his kitchen table is the reason I wanted to tell you this whole story. Daniel let her in. He didn't know what else to do. He sat her down at the same kitchen table where his wife had walked past their crying daughter 3 weeks earlier. He poured her a cup of coffee. Her hands were still shaking when she wrapped them around the mug. And then Margaret Cole told him the truth. The whole truth. The truth nobody in that family had ever said out loud. "I owe you an apology," she began. 9 years of them, actually. And I'm too old and too tired to leave this world without saying them. Daniel started to speak. She held up a hand. "Let me finish, please, because if I stop, I might not start again." She took a breath. "When Vanessa brought you home, I judged you. I thought you weren't good enough for her. No college degree. A working man's job. Quiet. I wanted more for my daughter. A big house. A big name. A man who'd make people jealous." Her mouth tightened. "I was a fool. And worse than a fool, I taught my daughter to want the same wrong things I wanted." She looked down at her coffee. "I watched you for 9 years, Daniel. I watched you get up before the sun. I watched you go without so that girl could have. I watched you love my granddaughter in a way that—" Her voice broke. She pressed her lips together and made herself go on, in a way that her own mother never quite managed. "And I said nothing, because I was proud, and I was stubborn, and I did not want to admit that the man I'd looked down on for 9 years was twice the person my own daughter had become." The kitchen was very quiet. Down the hall, Daniel's daughter was asleep. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. "Do you know when I knew?" she said. "When I really knew what kind of man you were. It was 3 years ago. That winter Lily had pneumonia, and she was in the hospital for 9 days. Vanessa came for a few hours each afternoon and then went home because she said the chair hurt her back and she couldn't sleep there. But you—" Margaret's voice shook. "You didn't leave that hospital for 9 days. 9 days, Daniel. You slept in a plastic chair. You held that little girl's hand through the night so she wouldn't be scared. The nurses told me. They said in 20 years they'd never seen a father like you. And do you know what I did with that information?" She laughed, a small bitter sound. "Nothing. I told myself it just meant you had no ambition, that a real man would have been out earning. I twisted the best thing about you into a flaw because I could not bear to admit I'd been wrong about you." She shook her head slowly. "That is the kind of blind that pride makes you, Daniel. I looked straight at a good man for 9 years, and I called it weakness." Daniel didn't know what to say. Nobody had ever spoken to him like this. Nobody in that family had ever, in 9 years, said a single kind word about the way he loved his family. "My daughter did a terrible thing to you," Margaret said. "And I did not come here to defend her. I came here to tell you that it was not your fault, that you were not too boring, or too poor, or too anything. You were exactly enough. You were more than enough. The problem was never you, Daniel. The problem was that Vanessa learned, from me, to measure a man by all the wrong things. And I have spent 3 weeks unable to sleep because I helped make her into someone who could look at a good man and call him not enough." And then Margaret did the thing that Daniel never saw coming. The thing that turned his whole understanding of the last 9 years upside down. She reached into her purse, and she pulled out an envelope, thick, worn at the corners, and she set it on the table between them and slid it across. "What is this?" Daniel asked. "Open it." He did, and inside was a stack of documents, and a bank book, and a folded letter in Margaret's careful handwriting. Daniel started to read, and the further he read, the more his hands began to shake, until he had to set the papers down on the table. Because here is what Margaret Cole had done. 12 years ago, when Vanessa and Daniel got married, Margaret's late husband, Vanessa's father, had set up a trust, a significant one, money that had been in the Cole family for 2 generations. It was meant to go to Vanessa, but there was a condition, written by a careful old man who had seen a thing or two about his own daughter's character. The money would only be released to Vanessa on one condition, that her marriage lasted, in good faith, for at least 10 years. If it did not, if the marriage failed because of infidelity or abandonment, the trust passed instead to the grandchildren, and it named a guardian to manage it. That guardian was Daniel. "My husband saw it," Margaret said quietly, "before any of us. He saw what Vanessa was becoming, and he saw what you were. He put that clause in the trust to protect the children, and to protect you. He told me, on his deathbed, that if it ever came to this, I was to make sure you knew, that I was to stand by the good man, not the easy blood." She wiped her eyes. "I have failed at almost everything a mother can fail at, Daniel. But I will not fail at this." Vanessa walked out. She abandoned her family for a man she met at a gym. Under the terms of that trust, she gets nothing, and every cent of it, held in guardianship, belongs to your daughter now, with you to manage it until she comes of age. Daniel could not speak. He looked at the numbers on the page, and they did not seem real. It was more money than he would make in 20 years of 10-hour shifts. Enough to pay off the house. Enough to make sure his daughter never wanted for anything. Enough to change everything. He sat there, and he thought about all of it at once. He thought about every double shift he'd worked so Vanessa could have the life she wanted. He thought about the way her mother had looked down her nose at him at 9 Christmases. He thought about Brett, and the sports car, and the midnight texts. And he thought about the fact that a dying old man, a man Daniel had barely known, Vanessa's own father, had looked into the future years ago and seen all of this coming. Had seen his own daughter's character clearly enough to build a wall to protect the grandchildren from it, and had trusted Daniel, the son-in-law nobody respected, to be the one standing on the right side of that wall. But that was not the part that undid him. The part that undid him was simpler than money. "You came here," he said slowly, "to tell me I wasn't the problem." "I came here," Margaret said, "to tell you that you were the best thing that ever happened to this family, and that we were too blind to see it. The money is just paper, Daniel. The trust is just my husband being wiser than the rest of us. But you deserve to hear, from someone in that family, that you are enough. That you were always enough." She reached across the table and put her small, cold hand over his. "You are a good man, and I am so deeply sorry it took me 9 years to say it to your face. Now, I want to tell you what Daniel did next, because a lesser man, a bitter man, might have taken that money and that vindication and used it as a weapon. But that was not who Daniel was. He did not gloat. He did not call Vanessa to rub it in her face. He did not post a word of it online, the way people do. He took the papers to a lawyer, a quiet, honest one, and he did exactly what the trust asked. He set the money aside for his daughter, every cent, in an account she could not touch until she was grown, with strict instructions that it be used for her education, her future, her security. He paid off the house, because a home for his little girl was the one thing he let himself take, and the rest he left untouched, growing, waiting for her. Then he did something else. Something that tells you everything about the kind of man he was. He called Margaret, and he asked her if she would like to be part of her granddaughter's life. Really part of it. Not the way she had been before, the disapproving grandmother at holidays, but really in it. Sunday dinners, school plays, the whole thing. Margaret cried on the phone for a full minute before she could answer. She told him later that it was the single kindest thing anyone had done for her in her entire life. That she had driven to his house that cold Thursday, fully expecting him to slam the door in her face, and that he would have been within his rights to do it. Instead, the man she had looked down on for 9 years had opened his home, and then opened his family, to the woman who'd helped teach her daughter to leave him. "You had every reason in the world to hate me," she told him, "and you gave me my granddaughter instead. I will never understand how a person becomes as good as you are, Daniel. But I thank God my granddaughter gets to be raised by it." Because here is the thing about Daniel Reyes. His wife had told him that being a good father wasn't enough. And in the weeks after she left, he had almost believed her. But the truth that Margaret had driven across town in the cold to deliver, was the exact opposite. Being a good man, a steady man, a man who shows up, is not a small thing. It is the only thing that lasts. The sports cars rust. The six-packs sag. The passion that burns that hot burns out just as fast. But a man who gets up at 5 and loves his family and keeps his word, quietly, for years, when nobody is clapping, that man is the rarest thing in the world. And Margaret Cole had lived 66 years before she understood it. Vanessa, for what it's worth, did not get her happy ending. The trainer named Brett lasted about 4 months. It turned out that a man who is impressed by a married woman at a gym is not, as a rule, a man built for the long haul. When the money she'd expected never came, when she learned about the trust and the clause and what her own father had done, she came back around. Not to Daniel. To beg. To explain. To see if there was any way to undo what she'd signed away. There wasn't. And Daniel, standing in his doorway, looked at the woman he had loved for 9 years, and he felt something he had not expected to feel. Not anger, not even sadness, just a quiet, settled peace. She stood on the same porch her mother had stood on months before, but she hadn't come with an apology. Daniel could see that right away. She'd come because the money was gone, and the trainer was gone, and the exciting life she'd traded her family for had turned out to be a few months of noise, and then nothing. She talked fast. She said she'd made a mistake. She said she'd been confused, that Brett had manipulated her, that she still loved Daniel, that they could start over. She said all the things people say when the consequences finally arrive, and they'd like very much to send them back. And Daniel just listened. He let her finish. And then he said the only thing that needed saying. "You told me being a good father wasn't enough," he said quietly. "You were wrong. It was always enough. It was everything. You just couldn't see it, because somebody taught you to look at the wrong things your whole life. Your mother figured that out, in the end. I'm sorry you didn't." He told her she would always be their daughter's mother, and that he would never keep the girl from her. But that the door to the rest of it, the door she had walked out of with 2 suitcases, was closed for good. Then he shut it, gently, and he went back inside to his daughter. The years that followed were good ones. Not flashy. Good. Daniel kept driving the forklift for a while, because he liked the work and he liked the men he worked with, and because he did not want his daughter growing up thinking money fell out of the sky. Eventually, he took some of his own savings, not the trust, his own, and went to night school and got a better job, one that let him be home for dinner every night. He coached soccer every Saturday until his daughter aged out of the league, and then he coached the younger kids anyway, because by then he'd learned the rules and the little ones needed somebody. Margaret became the grandmother she should have been all along. She was at every Sunday dinner until the day she passed, for years later, in her sleep, at peace. In those 4 years, she and Daniel became something neither of them expected. Not just family by paperwork, but real friends. She'd sit at his kitchen table on Sunday afternoons while Lily did her homework, and the 2 adults who'd once had nothing but a wall of judgment between them would talk for hours. She taught Lily to bake. She showed up to every school play in the front row. She lived long enough to become, in the end, exactly the person she'd spent most of her life being too proud to be. Daniel gave the eulogy. He called her the bravest person he had ever known, because he said it takes a special kind of courage to look at your own biggest mistake, drive across town in the cold, and try to make it right. Most people never do. Most people carry their pride to the grave. Margaret set hers down on a cold Thursday porch, and it gave her 4 of the happiest years of her life. And Daniel, well, a few years on, at one of his daughter's soccer games, he got to talking with another parent on the sideline, a woman named Sarah. Kind eyes, easy laugh, raising a boy on her own after a hard divorce of her own. She didn't ask him what car he drove or what he benched. She asked him how he was doing, and she actually waited for the answer. And when he told her, honestly, about the long shifts and the tired nights and the joy of raising a girl on his own, she didn't look at him like he was small. She looked at him like he was rare. Because to a woman who'd been through what she'd been through, a steady man who shows up wasn't boring. He was the whole dream. They took it slow. Daniel had learned to take things slow. He wasn't in a hurry to hand his heart to anybody ever again, and Sarah understood that, because she felt the same. But it turned out that being a steady, reliable, show-up kind of man was exactly what the right person had been looking for all along. Their kids grew up together. It was, in the quiet, unremarkable way that the best things are, a happy ending. The kind Vanessa had gone looking for in a gym and never found. His daughter grew up strong and kind and sure of herself, raised by a father who had shown her, every single day, what it looks like when somebody stays. His daughter grew up strong and kind and sure of herself, raised by a father who had shown her, every single day, what it looks like when somebody stays. She never did touch that trust for anything foolish. When she turned 18, Daniel sat her down and showed her the account, and the letter her grandfather had written, and the letter her grandmother Margaret had left for her before she passed. And Lily, who was by then a young woman with her father's steady eyes, decided on her own to use it to become a nurse. Because she remembered, in the way children remember things, 9 days in a hospital when she was small, and a father who never left the chair. She wanted to be that for other people's children. Daniel says that was the proudest day of his life. Prouder than any paycheck. Prouder than anything. When she was old enough, Daniel told her the whole story. About the suitcases. About her grandmother in the cold. About the trust. And about the 4 words that had almost broken him, and how wrong they turned out to be. Don't ever let anybody tell you, he said to her, that being good isn't enough. Being good is the whole thing. It's the only thing that was ever worth anything at all. The night his wife left, a man stood in a doorway and watched his life get packed into 2 suitcases, and he believed, for a little while, that he was not enough for anyone. He was wrong. He'd been enough the entire time. It just took a knock on the door on a cold Thursday night, from the last person he expected, to finally make him see it.